Thank you very much, and thank you, David. If we weren't for David, we wouldn't be here. We met him at the Frankfurt Book Fair, where we were launching the Chinese edition of China's Megatrends. That was in October, I guess. It had been published in China in September, and it's just now this last week published in the U.S. The U.S. publishers lagging a little behind, even though they didn't have to translate it. But that's another story. That's another story. We're going to talk here, not for very long, maybe 15 or 20 minutes, to kind of frame where we're coming from, because we want to have a conversation with you. We want to talk to you about what your questions are. How many of you have been to China? Wow. Well, maybe we better regroup here. That is terrific. That is terrific, and it's part of the world that we've been talking about. Well, we've been talking this last week, especially intensely, as we've been book touring here in the States, and we book toured in China, which is another experience, and really interesting, and not that much different actually from book touring in the States. But you know, as we've talked about China and with some of our interviewers and so forth, sometimes the talk about China and what they're doing and how they relate to us and are they a threat or an opportunity, sometimes it gets quite emotional.
Yes.
I would say.
And you have mentioned David. We got to know David in Frankfurt, and Frankfurt was sort of a clash between China and Germany, and the question in where China stands and what China stands for. And the same emotions we sometimes face here. And when we were in China, of course the Chinese asked us, what can we do to make our picture, the picture the world has of us, better? And it's quite a bit of a communication question. How does China communicate what it is, and how does the West try to understand what China really is? And in China, we used an example because it is somehow as if the world would be a neighborhood into which a new neighbor has moved. And this family has not gotten too much attention for quite a while, but all of a sudden, this family starts improving its house, and it gets the attention of the other neighbors. And of course, with anything that is new in a certain environment, what starts first is gossip. And gossip is more interesting if it's negative gossip. So we shouldn't be astonished if what we hear about China is mostly negative, although not everything is gossip. Some is quite justified. But it should be balanced. And we, as the established neighbors, if we call the West this, we should try to get a picture of what this new neighbor is really like. And this was where we started when we wrote our book. We wanted, taking the experience John has in China and the smaller experience I have with my 10 years compared to his 40 years.
Don't exaggerate. 40 years in China.
To analyze what China is really like and what China stands for.
Well, you know the extraordinary story of the rise of China, but it bears repeating. In 30 years, China went from the 137th GDP, 137th economy in the world, same as Malawi, in just 30 years to becoming this year the second largest economy in the world. Extraordinary. And of course, we've got to understand what that means and how that impacts on all of us. But already 470 of the Fortune 500 of the U.S. are in China. And we're already doing all this business, and that's partly why they rose up to number 2. But I want to put that in perspective, too. There are 3 countries that are about the same, have the same size of economies. Germany, Japan, and China. And China moved up past Germany last year. It'll move past Japan this year to be number 2. But these 3 countries, their size of their economies is between 4 and 5 trillion. That's it. So when China moves up to be number 2, it'll be 5 trillion something. The U.S. is 14 trillion. That's the larger picture. So China is not going to pass the United States by next Christmas, as a lot of some headlines would suggest. It's going to take a long time. But it's interesting what they're doing, because it's not only the GDP. The GDP is just a collective figure, and the more you put all the figures together, the more you lose intelligence. And there are certain parts of that Chinese GDP that are really going to move very, very fast. And those are in the new technologies. You've heard of BYD, the company that Warren Buffett invested in. He's the largest foreign investor in it. They make the electric car. They're going to introduce the electric car. It's a hybrid initially into this country this year. But that's a new technology. The head of that company said something very interesting. He said, we can't possibly compete with Ford and a lot of the big Western companies who have had 100 years of experience with the gasoline-driven cars. However, with the electric car, we are all at the same starting point. But it's not only with the electric car. They're looking at robotics, at biotechnology, at telecommunications, at nanotechnology, all of the new technologies where everybody is at the same starting point. They're not going to compete back there where the West has got all this experience. It's very, very smart. So that while it'll be maybe 20 or 25 years before China, quotes, catches up with the U.S., if it ever does, in many, many areas, China is going to excel. And something else you must know, and that is that today, and this seems to be, you probably know it, many of you, but it's a surprise to everybody else. China's economy is now 70% private. 70% private. Private sector economy. That's what China is all about. This is the private sector. So the other thing I think that we like to talk to people about is that there are no communists in China. China is a country with no ideology. It's not communist. It's not capitalist. It's something entirely different. It's a pragmatic building of a new social economic system. And that's a system that we have called vertical democracy.
You all know that about 200 years ago, with the Constitution of the United States, America founded or created the modern Western democracy. We believe that China is on the way to create a counterpart, another kind of democracy, which, as John said, we called vertical democracy. And I want to make a little drawing so that we can visualize how we got to the understanding and why we call it a vertical democracy.
Here's on this side.
We began looking at Western democracy, because you can imagine when we were studying China, we were not content with socialism with Chinese characteristics. That does not really express what it is. So we looked at the West, and we find that this is a sort of a horizontal structure where the people all are equally entitled to periodically elect a government. So these are the periods. And to simplify, in this Western democracy, you have Party A and Party